Here's a really delicious recipe for steak that's done in the oven rather than on the stove. Instead of having to set off your smoke alarm with a hot greasy pan, all the work is done under the broiler. The best thing about this though is that the steak goes from the freezer to the broiler without a lot of mess involved. I'm also going to show you probably one of the best steak sauces you could possibly ever have to go along with it. It also just feels right to serve this with French fries for that classic steak frite vibe. Those are going to be made in the oven as well. You're going to want to make this. Let's start with the sauce because honestly, it does take a while, but it's the best part, so it's absolutely worth it. We're gonna make this in two phases. The first is the longer process of making a base sauce to build off of. This is brown sauce or Espagnole. It's one of the French mother sauces, which mean the French are very particular about this, and we're probably gonna upset somebody. For aromatic flavor, chop 1 whole yellow onion, 1 large carrot, and 1 large celery stick. This gives you a base that's about 2 part onion to 1 part carrot and 1 part celery. This is pretty classic for a preparation like this, but I honestly don't worry about any kind of fancy cuts here, just chop them down into smaller pieces. We need 900 mils of beef stock for this, which I always just use better than bouillon. The end results are so delicious that it's okay that we use this here. However, because it isn't homemade, we're gonna be missing some of the beautiful gelatin you get from a good homemade stock. That's what turns it into those jello cubes that you see. To mimic that delicious mouthfeel, pour a pack of unflavored gelatin into a few mils of cold water. This is a cheat code that I use all the time. In a large pot, begin melting 55 grams of butter until it's foamy. Do this over medium-high and then in your mirepoix. Let this cook for a few minutes until the onions have taken on a little bit of color, and then add in 55 grams of flour and mix that in to fully incorporate it into the butter and vegetables. It's gonna start out kind of clumpy and it's gonna cling to the vegetables, but we need to cook this out until it darkens slightly. It gives us some thickening and some flavor for the sauce. You can now add your beef stock slowly in stages. Really, we just need to make sure there aren't lumps in the roux, but this is gonna cook for long enough that they should work themselves out if they form now. Simply just add it slowly in stages and mix in between each stage. Sauce Espagnole does include tomatoes, and for this version, I like it to be in the form of tomato puree. It's really easy to work into the sauce this way. Add in 120 grams of that here, and then add in 5 peppercorns along with 2 bay leaves, and then a bunch of parsley. Just grab a handful and toss it in. We're gonna strain this in the end, so don't worry about these large bits now. Add in your gelatin mixture and then bring this up to a simmer. For now, we're gonna turn this down way low, pretty much like as low as it can go while still kind of burbling. We're gonna need to reduce this by about half in the course of the next 2.5 hours. As this cooks, you do need to stir this every now and then just to make sure it's not bubbling aggressively, nothing on the bottom is burning. Anything that happens at this point is really gonna impact the flavor of the final product, so make sure that it's cared for in a really nice way. Just checking this at the 2-hour mark, it looks great, but it definitely still needs a little more reduction. 30 more minutes should be almost perfect for this. Once it hits this point, it should be the thickness of about heavy cream. This can be strained and then cooled and set aside for use later. This is crazy delicious on its own, but we haven't really seasoned it for final eating because this is still gonna go through another process. This is just the base sauce that we're gonna build off of. If I'm completely real with you, this is kind of reminiscent of SpaghettiOs, which is probably heresy to say, but that kind of like deep tomato-y brown richness kind of tastes like cracking open a can of SpaghettiOs and just diving in there. I don't know, that's probably bad to say, and it's not the most appealing sounding thing, but trust me, this is going to transform into something really special. To make that transformation, start by thinly slicing around 70 grams of your standard button mushrooms. Just grab a handful of these and you're gonna be set. Begin melting 30 grams of butter in a saucepan and add in your mushrooms. Cook this over medium-high until the mushrooms have cooked off all their water and begin to brown in the butter. Once you see really nice browning and some dark bits, add in 120 grams of red wine and then cook this until most of the wine is gone. This sort of initial reduction usually takes like 5 to 10 minutes or so, depending on your heat and how much you're actually cooking off. Now we're gonna add in 120 grams of beef stock, along with 240 grams of that delicious Espagnole that we made. Initially, there's not too much here before the flavors really begin to mingle and cook. So this needs about 25 minutes of simmering to really turn into that magical, delicious brown sauce. There's a name for this sauce, it's called Marchand De Vin, which is a French name for wine merchant. It's kind of that like wine heavy, use a good dry red wine and you end up with a sauce that's really delicious and rich and flavorful, hence the name. Season this with salt, pepper, and I like to season it with MSG and some pulled thyme. At about the 25-minute mark, this should be good and beautifully seasoned, beautifully deepened, and beautifully colored. You're gonna notice this like really dark brown, beautiful color to it. Pass this through a sieve if you want it really smooth, or leave the mushrooms in for a much more rustic vibe. If you're like my dad, you're gonna wanna strain it. He still seems to hate mushrooms, even after I try to convince him otherwise. The flavor in this sauce is completely unreal. Do one last pass on seasoning with salt and pepper and keep it warm on the stove so we can finish up the dish. At this point, it's a good idea to start work on some potatoes for the fries. This is a really easy way to make super delicious fries without the actual frying. Heat your oven to 425 degrees convection and then place your tray in the oven on the bottom rack to heat with it. This makes such a huge difference and makes the browning happen in about half the time. We're gonna start by washing and peeling 2 large russet potatoes. If they're kind of smaller, use about 2 per serving. If they're really big, use about 1 per serving, and then slice them into large-ish fries. I like to square off the edges just so I get pretty even fries here, and then place them into cool water after slicing to wash off the starch and keep them from browning. These do need to be large enough to not break in the oven, but I don't want them super thick like a wedge is. They're somewhere in between a wedge, a steak fry, and a shoestring. When you're cutting anything, especially something that's slippery like a potato that's been peeled, it's really, really important to have a sharp knife. It's more efficient and it keeps you from cutting yourself. A dull knife is actually more dangerous than a sharp one because you're gonna put more pressure on it and then you end up slipping and then kind of nicking yourself. And that's where the sponsor of today's video, Knife Aid, comes in. Knife Aid is a fast and easy mail-in sharpening service that gives you a reliable way to sharpen your knives. You simply go to the website, tell them how many knives you need sharpened, and then they send you a nice prepaid envelope with all of the knife sleeves you need. You use these sleeves to keep the blades safe during shipping and they handle the sharpening. Their expert knife smiths hone the edge back to razor sharp and they send them back to you in about 4 to 7 days, so you're not without your knives for a long time. They can also take care of your serrated knives or bread knives that are really hard to sharpen at home. Check them out using the link in my description, and thank you so much to Knife Aid for sponsoring this video. Okay, back to potatoes. This is also a really important time to take your steak out of the freezer. We're gonna need about 20 minutes of defrosting or so on this guy for it to be like perfect, ready to go into the oven. Drain the water out of your potatoes and place them in a microwave safe bowl with a lid and a little bit of water. Be sure that your lid doesn't fully seal them though. You don't wanna create like a really tight fitting that's gonna cause the steam to kind of create a pressure system. If you're using saran wrap, poke some holes in it. If you've got a lid, make sure it's a jar. This is gonna go in the microwave on high for 1 minute and then you're gonna mix it around just so everything's evenly getting heat. You're gonna put it in for another minute, take it out and mix it again. And then it's gonna go in for one last minute and mix. So that's 3 minutes in total. Basically, this is just cooking the inside barely so that they can get extra crisp in the hot oil without having to sit in the oven for like 45 minutes. The microwave is so good at this that I think it's a bit of a waste to boil water to cook these. It's really tender on them while also cooking the inside really nicely. Drain the little bit of water that's in them and then toss them in a sprinkle of potato starch, literally just like grab a couple pinches of it until they're just coated, and a drizzle of olive oil. The starch and oil create a coating that crisps up really beautifully in the oven. I tried these with the coating and without the coating, and the coating version was miles better. Season this with a lot of kosher salt now, and then pull your tray out of the hot oven. Put a small layer of oil down on your tray just so they don't stick, and then drop on your potatoes. It's good to try to place them in a way that every single potato is in its own little space with air around them, so use a big enough sheet tray. Place them in the oven and set a 7-minute timer. We're gonna do these in small increments so the texture can get even on all sides. At the 7-minute mark, check to see how the first side is coming. You wanna see if it's gotten any color, and light brown is great here. If not, let it go for like another 2 to 3 minutes or so. If it is brown, give them a flip and do another 7 minutes. I like to do this about 3 times so that they can get brown on almost all sides, but they can get really dry if you cook them for longer than like 25 minutes in total. At around the 21-minute mark or so, these should be nice and crunchy on almost all sides. If they're not, keep on cooking them for a few minutes just to make sure. It's really easy to just gauge based on your oven and how they're coming along. Fries can usually be pretty messy to make, but this makes them just as easy as opening a bag from the freezer. These are going to pair perfectly with a steak, and they're really easy to make. As you can see, it's about 25 minutes for French fry perfection. The last, and ironically the easiest step, is the steak itself. Turn your broiler on high and make sure there's a rack near the element. You don't want it right up against it, so on my oven, the second level is perfect. This is a 1.5-inch New York strip steak that is from the freezer. This is what we took out of the freezer about 20 minutes ago. The cut here matters less than the thickness. This needs to be at least this thick to work well under the broiler. Anything thinner is gonna end up pretty close to well done before a crust can really form. The fact that this is frozen / barely defrosted matters a lot. This is going to allow us to create a nice crust on the outside before the inside overcooks. It's been sitting out for about 20 minutes, so the outside is just slightly defrosted, but not really at all. Rub your steak in a little oil and then load on the kosher salt. One of the biggest mistakes for steaks like this is just not putting enough salt on it. Trust me, it's gonna be okay. It's gonna help season the dish and it's gonna help set the crust. Do this on both sides and then place it on a rack over a sheet tray. Place it under the broiler and set a 3-minute timer. You don't wanna burn this, and that can happen with a broiler depending on your element, so you're gonna wanna keep an eye on how much it's browning. This is gonna be enough time to just start the crust formation, but it's not gonna nearly cook it. At that 3 minutes, take it out and then flip it and place it back under the broiler for 3 more minutes. Take it out, flip it, and 3 more minutes. So far, this is about 9 minutes of cooking. You're gonna start to see a little bit of color, but it still needs more time on the inside. Now we're gonna take it out, and I like to place a little bit of oil on this last top side, and then don't flip it, place it back in for 3 more minutes. Essentially, this is setting the crust on what will be the bottom side, and we're gonna take it out and let it rest, probably like 10 minutes or so. Leave your broiler on here because there's one final step. The resting is gonna allow the cook to kind of solidify and even out into a nice rare pretty much all throughout the steak. So this resting is really important for that. Slice it like slightly thick, not super thick, but you don't want it thin here. You're gonna notice that it is rarer on the cook right now. That undercookedness is on purpose. Take it and place it back on the sheet tray with the less crusted side facing up. If it needs a little more oil, place a little more oil on top. And this sliced steak is gonna go in one last time for 3 more minutes under the broiler. You're gonna wanna keep an eye on it at this stage because you can monitor the cook and the browning all at once. This is that final heat the steak needs to finish cooking, finish browning, and create a really beautiful looking steak on the plate. If at that last point it's undercooked for you, this gets you to about a medium rare, medium, depending on your element. If that's undercooked for you, you can just put it in for a little bit more. At this point though, it's probably gotten all the color it can take, so set it on a lower rack. I got this sort of technique from watching and wanting to recreate those fancy steakhouses you see in places like New York, places like Peter Luger's, where they pull the steak out of the broiler and it's sliced and it's sizzling and it's just like beautifully colored and dark and crispy, and I really wanted to emulate that at home. My main issue with general steak cookery is how messy and greasy the whole thing is. My stove usually gets like absolutely blasted with splatters, and the final result is usually a little bit too kind of greasy for what I really want with the steak at home. Like, I don't love having just a ton of greasy steak. Sometimes I want something that's a little bit cleaner and a little bit beefier tasting, and this totally nails that. Especially with something like this sauce that we made and put so much effort into. The idea of pairing that with like a really greasy, garlicky, buttery steak, it doesn't sound bad, it just sounds like one thing really clashing with the other. When you've got a super clean, salty, beefy flavor and a sauce that's just full of aromatic pungency, it's a match made in heaven. You can also do something totally wild, which is just completely skip the sauce in general. Don't make it, just make steak frites without it and serve it alongside some ketchup or something. Getting this one right took a ton of work because I think it's worth it to know how to make a steak in the oven versus on the stove. Essentially, this has taken all of the guesswork out of cooking because you're gonna be slicing it before you're serving it and before it's finished. So if you don't like where it's at when you slice it, great, it's going back in the oven anyways. Serve this alongside those potatoes of roasted vegetable of your choosing, and you've got a really impressive steak dinner that you didn't have to set your smoke alarm off for, and I think that's absolutely a win. Massive shout out to the amazing people supporting me directly on Patreon through patreon.com/CameronMarty. They get some cool benefits for supporting the channel, and I get to keep doing videos like this, which is a total win. They're amazing, and I really appreciate them. I've got a lot of cooking content on the channel, stuff like this video where I cook everything from the Bear Season 1 that I think you're gonna really enjoy. There are 11 recipes in this video, so it's totally worth your time. Thanks again to Knife Aid for sponsoring this video, and thank you so much for watching. Cheers.